Well, good morning and good afternoon and good evening. It's a distinct pleasure to welcome you to the second of our series around helping women succeed in leadership. And it's a distinct pleasure to be here. I'm Rebecca Ray. I'm the Executive Vice President of Human Capital here at the Conference Board. And we've had a terrific time sharing some of the highlights of some recent research. And I'd like to continue in our journey today. But just before we do that, just a couple of housekeeping things. You can see that you have opportunities to earn continuing education credits. They're pretty straightforward. You'll need to type in your name and your email address in the box that you see. And also, if you'd like the third type of CPE credits, remember that you'll be prompted several times. You'll need to remain upright and awake in the chair in order for that to happen. So without further ado, let me introduce my colleague on this project, and to share with you, she's going to be very helpful today. We have some tremendous guests, but please welcome again Beatrice Gretsch-Cumbo. She is the Senior Client Partner and the leader for much of the Advancing Women Worldwide projects at Korn Ferry, and it's just been a pleasure to work with you on this project. Thank you for coming in today.
Thank you, Rebecca. I'm thrilled to be here. And I'm also really excited that today we have three senior women from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey that are going to be able to share their story. We actually highlighted several case examples in our report, and we're going to begin this series of the webcast with listening to their stories. We're going to have Mary Lee Hannell with us, who is the Chief Human Capital Officer, and we're going to have also Lillian Valenti, the Chief Procurement Officer, and Deborah Torres, who is the Chief Ethics and Compliance. And before we start, I just want to say a few things about the Port Authority and the significance that they play here in the region. They manage all the tunnels and bridges, transportation between New York and New Jersey. I often hear them referred to as a quasi-government agency. They have a great combination of finding the leading practices between public and private, and we're just thrilled today to have them with us to talk about what they're doing to advance women.
Well, you know, it's a real treat to have them with us today on the webcast. We don't always have that opportunity, but I remember so clearly when we first started this project last fall, and they hosted groups of senior women, particularly those who were in the HR space, and many of these executives shared their stories. And I remember hearing firsthand just how powerful those stories were. So I'm thrilled that we can replicate a small part of that for the webcast today.
Yeah, it's great.
Very good.
And today what we're going to do is, at the beginning, we're just going to share a little bit about the findings from the report. And then we're going to quickly get into a conversation with the three senior women we have. You'll also hear us mention some of the leading practices that we found really accelerated women's development.
So just to refresh your memory, although I think of the 800 people or so we had on the last webcast, you may have forgotten some of the important details. So just very briefly, this is the research in question. Again, this was about building on some of the work that Korn Ferry had done around women CEOs. It's really a terrific piece if you haven't had a chance to read it. But this was to try to take a look at how we can increase the representation of women throughout the leadership pipeline. We wanted to reach out specifically to heads of HR and to women leaders and ask about those critical points in that leadership journey, and to really try to get at why this happens, why this continues to be a perennial problem, even with some great intentions and some great efforts. And we wanted to look at the specific development practices that could be helpful here. And then, of course, as Beatrice has alluded to, there are several companies that are profiled for some great work. And at the end of the webcast today, we'll talk about a future one with another organization as well. So just to set the stage, we did ask the question as to what we thought, or what folks thought would be an adequate representation of women across the leadership pipeline. And on average, there were some kind of wild guesses, but on average, it was pretty close to the 46% mark. And you can see that even when that first turn from individual contributor to manager, it's slightly less than 50%, but you can see that the representation of women continues to decline as the leadership ranks increase. And that's very sobering. And so what we wanted to try to get at in this report was what can we do, particularly at two really critical points. that first turn from an individual contributor to manager, and then as you move into the SVP level of leadership ranks. So in summary, the report shares really 10 suggestions as to what can be done across the board. And I'll give you just a moment to take a look at this slide, but there's a couple that I think we'd like to just especially call out. All of them are leading practices, and all of them have resonated with the senior leaders who are in charge of leadership development at their organizations. So Beatrice, are there any that you would call out in particular?
Yeah, the first one really is the one that I think is so important, that engage and identify high potential women early and have those candid conversations. We know that sometimes women don't often aspire to senior positions or actually don't envision themselves. So leaders having those conversations earlier is very, very critical. The other one that jumped out in the report was implementing programs for pay equity. And we debated that, as you remember, as a team. We weren't surprised that it was near the top of the list. I think the issue there is that women really want to believe, and they want organizations to demonstrate that they value, and that part of that translates into, am I paid well? Right. Is there equal pay for equal work? So that's the other one that we're hearing a lot of conversations with clients about.
Yeah. I think the couple that they're really interrelated, and it's really about giving women who are tagged as high potential, or certainly with a great deal of room to grow, to engage them in conversations and to really help them understand how it is possible and what the organizational support's going to be, and then to give them the series of experiences that build confidence. And one of those has to be P&L experience, for sure, and operational roles to the extent that that's at all possible very, very early on. So let me suggest that we begin to tap the folks who are with us today, because that's really the whole purpose, isn't it? So I'm going to ask a question, and let's begin with Mary Lee Hannell. And Mary Lee, in the report, we certainly profiled the great work that you and the team have done, and certainly some of the success profiles of senior women. But it really does take commitment from the top. And I know that's critically important. Commitment from the top is important no matter what initiative you're trying to drive. But can you talk a little bit about getting that commitment, and then really where the real work starts? Because that's where you build, but there's a whole lot more that must come from that. And I wondered if you could take us through sort of your experience leading that charge.
Sure.
Thank you
for
being
having
here.
us, first of all. I will tell you that at the Port Authority, we are fortunate to have a fairly new senior leadership team. And we have an executive director who's made it very clear throughout the organization that there is a very, very strong commitment to women in senior leadership positions, and not just in senior leadership positions, but in those pipeline positions where you often find women falling out. So he's made very, very clear that there's a strong commitment. We have an aspirational goal of having 40% of women in leadership positions. We measure that monthly in our senior staff meetings when our most senior leaders sit around the table with him, and we actually talk about what actual hires, what promotions, what movement we've made in our organizations around advancing women. So it is a very sharp focus. It's very clear. We actually throw up all the statistics for people to look at all together. We talk about what the barriers are that are in our way. We talk about good ideas, or try and share good ideas that each of us has, so that we are a team who is actually trying to effectuate great change. And I'm happy to say, when I look at 2018 numbers, in leadership, about 32% of our senior leadership is women. Our pipeline is 27%, so we have some work to do there, but we are working hard at it. And just with regard to our hires and our promotions, we're at about 39% females and 49% in terms of promotions. So we're making headway. Unfortunately, making massive change takes a tremendous amount of effort and time, but it starts with everyone being in the game and people being really clear about what you have to do.
You know, Mary Lee, many of us talk about the things that we want our leaders to do and the things that we want to accomplish, but not every place has that same level of transparency and accountability that you're talking about. You know, if everyone understands what the end goals are and everyone understands where we are in the journey and everyone has a chance to see who needs help or how we support each other, that's pretty rare. That must make you rather proud, I would think, that you have that kind of an organization where there's a commitment, but there's also the accountability.
It does, and I do think it's unusual. I do not want to gloss over the fact that it's hard work, and that it's a constant challenge, and it's a constant conversation, and a constant clear and sharp focus. Because it's easy to lose sight of that when business needs to get done and work needs to be addressed. It's easy to lose sight of the things that we have to do to really encourage women and other underrepresented groups to actually get in the limelight, take on assignments, be part of the program. It's a lot of hard work. But yeah, we are very proud of what we do.
I would think so. That's no small undertaking. And, you know, there's a level of transparency that I think companies are going to be forced to embrace if they haven't already, as you folks have. There's a generational surge coming in that really requires that. And I think that's where a lot of the conversation around pay equity starts to come into as well.
You know, Mary Lee, I loved when you were saying it's really constant challenge and focus. And in the report, we talk about really the inflection point that we think we're at from the HR perspective. And we know that that's not easy. And what I'd love to hear you talk about is tell us a little bit about the hardest part of that when you think about courage and what needs to be done.
Oh, there are many really difficult parts of it. I will tell you that sometimes in our rush to get the business done, what has to happen is we have to call a timeout, and we have to push pause, stop a process that doesn't have a diverse enough of candidate pool of highly qualified folks in it. We have to push pause on a promotion process that does not have a full slate. We have to push pause on an interview panel that doesn't represent the diversity that it needs to represent in order to make sure that we get the best candidates and of the highest quality. So those are tough things for an HR person to have to do, and tough things for senior leaders to have to do because we have so much work to get done. But those are some of the points. The other point that actually Deborah can talk about more effectively than I is that we have done a lot of unconscious bias training. And it is amazing when you get a small group of executives who think they are very worldly, and they are. But when you get them into a room and you start to really dissect what unconscious bias is and what it looks like and how it can be perceived and all the invisible kinds of unconscious bias, it really has opened up a new world to people. And so we've done a lot of training as well, and Deborah's led that effort across the organization. So there are a lot of component pieces
That's great.
to it.
And we know that, you know, often the first step is that awareness building of unconscious bias. And maybe we'll ask Deborah here if there's anything that she might add around that journey, what's important, and how do you really get leaders to take that very serious to start to change some behavior?
Well, I think that one of the things you have to recognize and help people recognize when you're training people on this topic is that everyone has biases. You're not always aware of them. And the goal isn't really to eliminate every bias because that's not really possible. What you have to help people do is become aware, more aware of the biases that they have and give them the tools to put those aside and take in all the other factors that they need to do when they're hiring, when they're promoting, when they're giving assignments. The work that's been done has involved both live workshops with senior and middle management, several computerized and mandatory courses that are part of our mandatory integrity training program, And we've gotten a lot of really good feedback on it, and a lot of it has been, I didn't realize I thought this. Now I'm aware. Now I can figure out ways to put that aside and not let that be the determinative factor in my decision making. And that's really got to be the goal. And you can't really make people feel guilty about the fact that they have these biases. Everybody does. They're different. You really have to give people the tools to overcome them.
Now, Deborah, we have a couple of comments coming in with regard to some of your remarks, and this question is, how do you encourage more women to take on technical roles in engineering? And it leads us right into the question that I think we'd love to know, which is, when you have an opportunity to help women see the path of leadership in an engineering environment, what word of advice would you have?
I think for the women themselves, I think you have to have the confidence to take risk. I think particularly in technical fields, some women don't enter them because they see them as male-dominated, and even if they're in those roles, they're afraid to take the risks that are necessary to actually make yourself eligible for leadership. I think our technical departments are making a lot of progress in making their work environments comfortable and inclusive and welcoming for women. But women need to not be afraid of putting themselves out there and asking for more responsibility and taking the risk to actually meet new challenges that they may not have done before.
Yeah, I'd love to ask Lillian this question. We know that decisions women make early in their career are very important. And I wonder if you could share, was there anything that you felt when you think about the path you've been on early in your career that really pushed you to where you're at today?
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm going to take you down a walk in memory lane to the first year that I started in the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. I'll leave it that it was many years ago, and there were not that many people in management at the time. I was at the Twin World Trade Center Towers, which are our corporate headquarters, in a rotation management development program, and it was my second month on the job. And my assignment was to conduct a very brief orientation program for people to come in from our facilities, airports, tunnels, bridges, terminals. They had to commute to the corporate headquarters. Not something that they were necessarily fond of for a 1-hour session. Nevertheless, I had my job. So I was in a classroom, and I was about halfway through, and a senior male executive came up with 6 people and asked me to vacate the room because he wanted to use it. And I thought that that was very disrespectful to the people that were in the group. And I asked him to come outside, and I said that I thought that perhaps we could make arrangements for him to go somewhere else. Little did I know at that point in time that not only was he a senior executive, but he was one of the most feared executives in the Port Authority, and most people would not even dare to offer their opinion. So I'll equate it to you when you're a kid and you learn how to ski, you're less risk averse when you're getting older in an organization. After I left the classroom, I went down to join my colleagues who were pale. Some of them had boxes ready for me. They told me pretty much, I don't know whether you're going to make it, Lil. And it was a very ironic situation that happened. That person became my mentor and sponsor for years to come. He showed me how important it was to be listened to in my first couple months at work, which is a very, very important onboarding experience for anybody. And it gave me the courage to continue to offer opinions, which is essentially why one hires someone. So that's story number one. Fast forward 2 years out, and I'm going to use your terminology from research. I had to throw a penalty flag. I am developing curriculum for off-premise conferences, week-long sessions that happen several times a year, and I'm looking across the room, and all of my male colleagues are getting the opportunity to teach. So I threw the penalty box out, and I went to my supervisor and manager and said I'd like the opportunity, and eventually had to go to the head of the department and find out and ask some pretty hard questions. Why not? And I was grateful to get the answer was, well, what would be the optic of a woman in a hotel with pretty much a population of men, and suppose something happens? So I had to give them a solution. I'm accountable, and if something happens, then you'll sit me down and deal with it. So I threw the penalty flag. I became the first woman stand-up trainer off premise in the conference center, and I passed those issues and stories and techniques on to other women for other situations. We've advanced much further. Third, again, picking up the conversation in the research, this one relates to courage. I was in charge of developing an executive development program for the first time for senior executives. It would be the equivalent of going from vice president to senior vice president. Very, very pivotal point for our senior executives. Never been done before. There were a bunch of assessment centers and role plays and 9 days of intense team building. And my male colleague and I went to the conference center the first day, and he told me the plan was that we would leave at the end of the night and leave the group there to assimilate for a couple days. I happened to have good hearing and overheard that he, in fact, had his bags packed and had them behind the desk, and I was told that we were both leaving. So I knocked on his door. We had a room for the day, and I told him that he had to loan me a shirt, a casual shirt, so that I was going to join them and stay overnight as well. And he was quite incredulous that I would do that. Quite ironically, I still have the shirt. It happened to be a pink Ralph Lauren shirt. And whenever I get a little hesitant, as the years go on, I always look at that as a symbol to continue to have courage, because you have to be in it to win it and develop. So those are the 3 stories that I take forward with me pretty much every year and pass them on in terms of their principles to other women.
That's great. Thank you.
You go, girl.
I love it.
That's great. That's great.
We're getting some questions about the demands of integrating work and personal life. And I wonder if I could ask Deborah to give us her perspective on what it takes to successfully, integrate both of those parts of your life.
Well, I started out as a lawyer in a law firm. I was in private practice. I didn't have my children until I was a young partner, which I thought would make it easier. And it did in some ways because I had a little more control over my time, but I was still working very, very, very hard. And I found it was really important to have some tools in place. One of those tools is a very supportive partner who views child rearing as an equal responsibility. Another was the advent of technology, which allowed me to bring work home. Another was having confidence in my childcare situation. The biggest problem, though, that I had to struggle with, and I think a lot of women still do, was that ambitious, competitive women view their obligations as a parent with the same perfectionism that they bring to their careers. And you have to learn you have to figure out for yourself what's truly important, what you really need to do, and what you don't necessarily have to do. When my children were little, a lot of their parents' friends were stay-at-home moms. They were often competitive about how much work they did for the school, how often they baked, whether or not the children of working mothers should be on play dates. And that was very disturbing at first, and I had to come to grips with the fact that I didn't have to be that kind of mother, and I didn't have to compete with them on those terms. The only thing that really mattered was whether our balance was right for our family. But as an ambitious and competitive person, it took me a while to get to that point. So it is really important to have the tools in place. It's very important to be in a work culture that is supportive of working families. I didn't really have that so much because this was a long time ago and I was in a male-dominated law firm. And I think employers have many more options nowadays for parents to balance work and life. But I really do think the most important thing is to figure out for yourself what the right balance is and not be intimidated or guided by what other people do. So that's the best advice I could give someone.
And I'll just add something here if I could. As the head of HR, I continue to get questions from primarily young, early career women entering the workforce about that moment in time when they decide to have a family. and the concerns that they have about, will I be able to accomplish my goals? Will I be able to take care of my family in the way I really believe I should? Will I be able to advance my career, or am I on some kind of holding pattern while I have my children? And as a mother of three, I will tell you that, and this was a number of years ago, my boss at the time said to me, you should be a director of the Human Resources Department, but you won't be the director because you have three children. And you can't possibly devote the time that's needed. And I said, watch me. And that very same person ultimately was the person who promoted me to director and then to chief. And so it's about changing the hearts and minds, about showing people that there are alternative ways to achieve the work-life balance. I will say, as you said, Deborah, technology makes a huge difference. And it's not just about having children, right? Mm-hmm. It's also about taking care of parents. It's about other obligations, whatever those personal obligations are, and putting them in the right perspective and the right frame so that you can spend part of your time working on the things outside of work that are important, and part of the time focusing on what's important at work. And recognizing, as I said last time, some days you win at one and lose at the other. Some days you win at both, and those you celebrate big time. And then some days you lose at both, and you just crawl under the covers and start over.
And I would also add that I think Deborah, Mary Lee, and I also try to put less pressure on the women as they have children and come back to work by balancing the fact that men also have opportunities to go home and take work remotely and deal with and help with parenting. And it really helps the women and the men to be able to sort of be on a more equal playing field in terms of the pressures together. So it helps alleviate a little bit of that guilt when you're showing the same type of emphasis to the men as parents as well.
That's a really good point, because I think there is not only a lack of recognition in some organizations that men also have work-life balance issues. And it destigmatizes the fact that women will sometimes need accommodations, sometimes will have points in their life when they need to balance one aspect of their lives a little differently than at other times. And the fact that you take a more equal approach to men and women helps destigmatize that for both men and women, because in a lot of places, you know, why do you need to do this? Why can't your spouse do this? You're the guy. And that's not a good place for either the men and women in the workplace to be.
You know, Deborah, I think that's an important point. You know, it's one thing to have policies and, you know, programs at an organization, but if culturally the messages get sent that you really shouldn't take advantage of, let's say, parental leave or anything else that helps with work-life balance, it's really sad, I think, because everyone needs help. And it might be children at one point, it might be elder parents, it might simply be health challenges, it could be a variety of things. Right. Everybody needs help. And it does take a village to get us all through the pipeline and out the door. So thank you for sharing that. You know, we've had a couple of folks make comments about how much they appreciate the three of you sharing so much about your own personal journey. So that's really resonating. I have a question here that maybe we could touch on a little bit. And it's really about what structural changes or what tools or what programs, particularly at the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, that might help women and also by extension all workers have more of that work-life balance. But what kinds of things have been done so that they don't need to make such perhaps wrenching decisions between personal life and work life?
Sure, I'm going to grab that one. We have done a number of different things. Some of those things are around policies. You need to have some policies and parameters in place, but we've tried to push that a step further, because what we found is, although we've had policies in place since 1987 around flexible work arrangements, very few people actually utilize them. And they didn't utilize them because the senior leaders weren't comfortable with them. So part of this, again, is around going back to the senior leadership team and talking with them about flexible work arrangements and about how the work can be done. So one of the things that we're working on right now is actually identifying positions across the organization before they become open for competition, and identifying which ones of those can have a more flexible schedule associated with them. So that at the time that someone is applying for that position, they have an understanding that they may be able to work from home, they may be able to, we have facilities all over New York and New Jersey, they might be able to work at a facility that's closer to where they live because they need that accommodation. But we're trying to actually identify that sphere of positions, and it doesn't work with all of them. But identify those ones where it can work, put those things in place before that manager is confronted with the reality of, oh boy, this person is may not actually be sitting behind that desk every day. How am I going to manage that? So we're asking people to think through it early. HR provides resources to help them work through that, and certainly technology provides support in how we work through that. And we're finding that resonates really well with the organization.
And I guess I would also add there are employee resource groups, ERGs. There are several different ones, but there is also one for women, and there are subcomponent committees and resources within those groups that align themselves to the programs and policies that Mary Lee talked of. So you get to replicate different buckets and sources of support around issues such as working remotely.
That raises some good points, and I'm getting some questions here around, having those conversations with women. And Mary Lee, it's great to hear you mention this. To help women have those conversations early on. So, Lillian, let me ask if I could. Much of our research showed that quite often women don't perhaps see themselves as readily being leaders or being in a leadership or successive leadership roles, until someone sort of sits down with them and says, I can see you being successful in this particular role. I wondered if there was something like that in your career that sparked you, and how that triggered a series of things for you. Is there something in your past that you can talk about to that extent?
Certainly. So I guess I fell into the category that I needed to know everything there I could know about the job that I was aspiring to, and needed to take those steps up the career ladder so that I could become completely proficient. So I was looking at my career path. I was very achievement oriented from the time that I was a kid. So I never wondered whether I could do it. I just thought that I was going to take a little bit too long to do it because I had to be the perfectionist. So as I aspired to, one of the roles that I aspired to was human resources, my sponsor at the time said to me, I am going to have a succession need in the procurement department. I'd like you to think about it. And I was, oh my gosh, what? And okay, just take a step back, go home and think about it. Well, of course, you go home and this is an opportunity. And I was terrified. I knew nothing about the profession. And it's a profession. It had just recently been centralized, so it involved construction, engineering, consulting, and vendors, contractors, and billions of dollars. And it was the best lesson that I have learned in my life about management and leadership, because you had to rely on the people that work for you to get the job done. You had to listen. You had to sort out those who were proficient versus those who were less proficient, so you could keep the place running. And it was a very, very valuable lesson for me in terms of not only for my own development, but also in terms of how I develop the people that work for me and how I mentor and sponsor other women.
So that's a great life lesson, Lillian, but you also had the Ralph Lauren shirt. So how could you not be successful? So I'm wondering, and thank you for that. So Deborah and Mary Lee, maybe quickly, you have a similar story or a time when you realized, someone had sort of sparked in you this belief?
When I was a young associate, I was working for a big firm down on Wall Street. Most associates don't make partner. And a lot of people come into big firms with the idea that they'll stay for a few years, they'll get the experience, they'll get the credential, and then they'll move on because opportunity for partnership for most of them. And I entered my law firm basically with that same attitude. I would work hard, I would get experience, I would get a great credential, and then I would move on and do something else, although I wasn't sure what that would be. And at some point, at the time I began exploring other opportunities, a partner that I did a lot of work for sat me down and said, you know, your partnership material. And my reaction was, oh no, that can't be right. And he really said, no, I want you to spend the next year thinking about, trying to become a partner, what that means for you, and whether you're willing to do it. So I did. And I did become a partner, but I really did not think that that was something I could aspire to when I first joined my firm. And so that conversation, with a man, by the way, was very liberating for me in one sense, because I was able to see myself and think of my future in a different way. And it built a lot of confidence that someone who I viewed with such admiration and respect was telling me that I could succeed on a long-term basis.
Thank you, Deborah. And Mary Lee, anything to add from your career path?
So I think that my experience was actually with a woman, a senior woman. She was someone who had overcome tremendous adversity. She had polio when she was a child. She was told she would never walk again. And she was not only walking when we met, she was my boss, she was running, usually after someone. So she was a very interesting person, because she was the first person who was really candid with me. And that's really important, because you don't find a lot of people who actually tell you the honest truth. You find, I got a lot of, you're wonderful, you're great, you're going to go places, rah, rah, but I didn't find a lot of people who actually sat down and took the time and said, here are the 3 things I think you're really fabulous at, right? 1, 2, and 3. Here are the 3 things that you need to fix, because if you don't fix them, you will not continue up the ladder, you will not get the opportunities, and you've got to level the playing field. You have got to work on those areas so that you can compete with everyone else. And she was dead on. And to this day, when I do some of that work, I like to tell people I'm in HR and I'm not the CFO, I'm the CHRO for a reason. But she was the person who said to me, financials and your grip of that side of the business is important no matter where you go. And that's something you're going to have to work on. You don't like it, you think you're not good at it, and right now you're not. So hunker down and get that skill behind you, because that is necessary no matter where you go. And that kind of not only acknowledgement of her being behind me, but real clarity around what I needed to work on and how I needed to get better at it. And she helped me get better at it. But very unusual to find somebody who actually tells you the truth. And if you can find a truth sayer in your organization or in your professional life who can have that honest conversation with you, I think that makes all the difference.
Oh, thank you, Mary Lee. That is very true. That's a rare gift when it comes from someone you respect and know has your best interests in heart. And we've all seen the most recent HBR cover that talks about why feedback fails. That's generally because it's offered by people who have no right to talk to you about anything. It's when you've earned trust and you know that they have your best interests at heart. You can hear a lot of things, sometimes difficult things. So thank you for sharing that. I have a question I'd like to ask each of you to very briefly to think about, and I perhaps ask you, Deborah, to start, and then maybe Lillian and Mary Lee. Few of us as leaders have had an unscathed career. We've had some kind of a setback. We've had some kind of difficulty. We maybe stepped back and went in a slightly different direction and came around another way, or we've had a change in the journey that was different from what we thought. Certainly, for most of us, it's not a very linear path. It isn't always lockstep. So I wondered if you'd be comfortable sharing either one of those difficult times or a setback, and then sort of what it taught you and how you got back on track. Deborah, could I start with you?
Sure. I spent 28 years at my law firm. I had been a litigator. I started to feel like I just didn't want to do litigation anymore. I had always enjoyed the adversarial process, but at some point I was losing interest in it. I had the opportunity to join one of my former partners who had left the firm a few years earlier and set up a consulting firm which focused on compliance consulting. And because this was someone I had worked with very closely over the years, it was easy to make the transition from my firm to working with this person at his consulting firm. So I didn't have at that point a lot of fear or concern or feeling like I was taking a huge risk by leaving my partnership. But within a few years, it became clear that the economic model that he had thought would sustain the firm in a two-city environment, because the firm was in Washington and I was located in New York, really didn't work. And so we decided to close the New York office. I wasn't willing to move to Washington to work with him there, so I was sort of all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, with no clear path and no obvious decision about which way I should go. Should I stay in compliance? Should I go back to practicing law? And I had never really had to face that kind of decision-making process in what had been a fairly linear career up until then. So I had to take some time to decide, well, okay, what is it I want to do? And I decided I wanted to stay in compliance. There was a reason why I decided not to litigate anymore. And for the first time since I was in law school, I really had to face a job market that had changed a lot in recent years. And that felt like a risky and somewhat scary proposition. But I decided, okay, I'm going to do it. And I did. So it wasn't so much a setback as a sudden change in what I thought my trajectory was going to be and what I was going to be doing for the next few years. And that can be really unsettling. And I guess you could view it as a setback for someone who always thought, you know, I was planned out this part of my life and the next part of my life and everything will progress in this way, to suddenly find myself with that uncertainty and that amount of risk. And the advice I would give for someone who finds himself in that situation is just go ahead and do it. You are not at as much risk as you think you are. You have all kinds of skills and talents and experience that you may have developed in one place, but are really transferable to another place. And don't be afraid to see yourself in that other place. Recognize everything that you've learned and developed over the course of your career, and don't be afraid to look for something else where you can use those same experiences and talents.
Terrific. Thank you, Deborah. Lillian and Mary Lee, just a quick thought?
Yes, another trip down memory lane back to the mid-90s. We had new executive leadership in the Port Authority, and unfortunately it was time for the first downsizing ever there. And I was put in charge of that. My great desire to help people and not have them hit the street, I had the idea to place them in vacancies in other parts of the organization. I had the insight of where the studies showed there should be downsizing, so I directed a team of people to begin the redeployment process so that the people could have alternate work experiences rather than unemployment and outplacement. That apparently was not quite aligned with the new leadership at hand. So it was my first time. Was it a setback? Yes. Was it a step to the side? Yes. But I felt like I did the right thing for the people, so I didn't really cry in my beer or whatever it was back then. But you have to learn how to suck it up and learn from it. And if you feel that you did something right for your organization, you need to move on. And if you can't move on, then you need to understand that the world is full of choices. And I made my choice to stay. And I ended up being in a really critical role after 9/11 in the Office of Medical Services, where I had the opportunity to do programmatic work for police, civilians, and employees. So again, the lemon became lemonade. Another ironic story.
But you know, Lillian, it's a perfect example sometimes is having the courage and the faith to know that you're going to be usually exactly where you're supposed to be. It's just sometimes you don't know it until you look back at it. Right. Thank you for that. Mary Lee?
Correct.
Yeah, so talk about being, sort of in the place that you don't think it's the right place. So I had decided that it was time for me to leave the Port Authority and take on some other challenges. And I was interviewing and had secured an offer at the time that 9/11 happened. And at that time, as you know, our headquarters was in the World Trade Center. Many of us were in the building that day. We lost many, many colleagues, and I made a decision that I needed to put on hold whatever it was I was doing at the time, because this was an organization that I didn't feel I could turn my back on at that time. So I sort of put aside what my plans were, and as I said, talk about, fate presenting opportunity and trying to make, as Lillian said, lemonade out of lemons. It was an extraordinary time at the organization, an extraordinary example of collaboration and teamwork and getting action done and decision making like the speed of lightning. And for us to get things up and running. And I had decided that I would stick it out until we came back to the World Trade Center and returned to our headquarters. And I had, in that time, become the director of HR and then the chief of human capital. And when we came back, rather than thinking, okay, I'm going to turn my sights outside and continue sort of that interruption in my career, I found that there were so many things that I had learned and so many more things that I still had to learn in this organization that I made an active decision to stay. I, have learned more since that time about, not just about what an organization can do, but how proud I am to work for an organization like the Port Authority that really knows how to not just take care of people of the region who are trying to, get about their lives every day, but how to care for the people in the organization itself. And so it's with great humility and a great, honor that I'm still here.
I think it was a very, very pivotal point for folks like Mary Lee and I who were in the building. It just coalesced everybody and brought out the pride and the passion, but it also, you had to be a change agent. I mean, there wasn't anything there. We had to put everything, start all from scratch. You had to pull out critical thinking, strategic thinking, leadership, empathy. I mean, it was everything that you read about and then some. And it leaves left a very lasting mark on all of us, which then helps you pull everyone else up with you, I think.
Well, I cannot imagine the experience that you folks went through, but I can say that we had a small glimpse into just how powerful that experience was and the incredible work that you and your colleagues did during those times. It was quite extraordinary to actually walk through and to see the rebuilding process and the massive undertaking that it was on so many levels. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to give each of you an opportunity to maybe just share a bit of advice, but I would like to address one of the questions that's come in. We've had some great ones. We've tried to work them in as we've gone along, but there's a question here around politics. And I know sometimes that seems much more pejorative than I mean it to, but let's say that the organizational savvy to know how to maneuver your career. How does that play itself out as you think about your careers, and what advice would you have about how people think about their own personal brand, their ways of moving through the organization? Maybe some thoughts on how that played itself out for each of you.
So let me start. I think that, politics, tough subject. There's small p politics and large capital P politics, and it's fair to say that we probably have both. But in terms of how you should conduct yourself, and you can spend hours trying to figure out what the right thing to do is on the political front, and you can spend days trying to take your crystal ball out and figure out what the right move is. At the end of the day, there are two things that I try and hold true. One is to be my authentic self. This is who I am. This is what you get. And every time I have altered who I am authentically, I have paid a price for it. So one piece of advice is to be who you are. Be the very best self that you can be every day, all the time. And the second one is to be truthful. And sometimes that means standing up and having the courage when people don't entirely want to hear the truth, and being brave and courageous enough to say it. And recognize that sometimes you're going to take some knocks for that, and it's not always going to be pretty, and it's not always going to be fun. But at the end of the day, you leave the organization knowing you've given them your very best thinking, your very best in terms of your experience, and you've stood up for what you think is the appropriate course of action, and you go home feeling good about what you've done and who you are.
In terms of being truthful, I think that I've learned over the years, and Mary Lee's quite right, we really do need to speak up. It's often much better to do that in as small a group as possible and behind closed doors, because when all is said and done, people are people, and we need to understand that people have egos and self-esteem, etc. With respect to the authenticity, I would tell other women that in order to be authentic, look to see who you relate to with respect to your style, and get mentored in terms of how you can behave. And pretty much we're talking about the small p most of the time, the people that we deal with and can develop.
Well, I've only been at the Port Authority for a little more than a year, and I came in oblivious to the small p politics at the Port Authority. Like a lot of people, I had read about the big P politics at the Port Authority. To my great pleasure and delight, the big P politics really haven't been in evidence since I've been here. The leadership team, the chairman and the executive director have been in total sync. When you sit in board meetings, you would not know who was a New Jersey commissioner, who was a New York commissioner, unless you had read their biographies. So from that perspective, the Port Authority has been, for me, a terrific place. In terms of the small p politics, I probably haven't figured them out yet at the Port Authority. So my approach has been to be open to everyone, to try and build working relationships and respectful relationships with as many different people as possible, which is frankly very important in terms of the function I lead. It's a new function, and part of it is building trust both in leadership and in the general population. And one of the big things that a chief ethics and compliance officer has to do is give employees confidence that when they see something that disturbs them or concerns them, they have somewhere to go, and that they will be able to go there and talk about what's concerning them without retaliation. And so that's such an important part of the ethics and compliance process that I've tried to model my approach to that. So I'm frank with people when I think I need to be frank, but I also have come in with no preconceptions about what the internal politics is. And so far, I think that's worked well for me.
That's great. We know that having role models, especially at the senior level, is so critical. So on behalf of the conference board and Korn Ferry, we want to say thank you to all three of you for being here. Absolutely. And maybe in final thoughts, maybe I'll in the interest of time, I'll ask Mary Lee if there's any final thoughts you'd like to share before we close that would be helpful for women aspiring to grow their careers.
So I think it's, don't be afraid of the hard work. Don't shy away from opportunity. As Lillian said, you've got to be in it to win it. You have to be authentic. I don't know that there's, I'd love to say there's a magic sauce I make and I have the recipe for you. But it's a lot about what you find inside of you. And if on those days when you're not feeling very stable with just looking inside of you, turn to the women standing shoulder to shoulder and who are sitting above you as your comrades and as your help, because they will support you more than you probably even know and more than you could possibly imagine. You do not have to do it yourself, and you're not in it alone.
Well, that's wonderful advice, and thank you. Let me just echo Beatrice's comments. We're so appreciative of the insights that you've shared today and for helping to make the story that we knew in the report really come to life for those who were able to join us today. So thank you so much for that. So if I could, I just want to capture a couple of slides here. And just thank all of you again for joining us, and especially our tremendous panelists. A couple of things that I would just mention in closing is that there'll be an opportunity to watch the third and final installment in this webcast series, and we'll bring together another group of folks to share their experiences, so please do choose to join us for that as well on April 25th. And my colleague Beatrice and some of her colleagues will be sharing more about this research at our upcoming Women's Leadership Conference. I will be sending great energy and excitement and support from Singapore, but that'll be another opportunity to dive into some of the findings, and hopefully there'll be nuggets that you can take away with you. So on that note, I'll just thank you, Beatrice, once again for joining me here in the studio, and for the opportunity to kind of explore this passionate topic for an awful lot of us. And again, our thanks to all of you who chose to join today, and we look forward to seeing you on future webcasts. We do have a short but important evaluation at the end, and if you'll take just a moment, I do take that very seriously. I actually read all the comments. Thank you for the kind words that have already come in, but if you wouldn't mind just taking an extra moment to do the survey, that would be greatly appreciated. I hope you have a terrific rest of the day or your evening. And again, if we can be of service to you here at the conference board, I hope that you'll reach out and let us know how. Thanks again. Take care now.